Okay. Great to see a nice crowd like this on a Sunday afternoon. This is our last official event of the 2017 Founders Day. And you're all being videoed, so do your best to look nice so when you see yourself on TV, okay? I really want to give a big shout out here. Thank you to the Kossuth County Genealogy Society, the Algona branch of the AAUW, people that have spent the winter months preparing for an event like this, doing research, finding out the history of the families we're about to meet, practicing what they'll be presenting to you. While the rest of us are out and about having fun, they're working and getting ready to put on a show like this. So let's give them a big hand in advance. And actors and actresses, don't get away. I have a really big, I couldn't get Oscars to hand you, so I went and got some Dairy Queen tickets, so I can get you a free Dairy Queen cone. That's my big prize that I can give this mayor. Okay, at this time, Gene Kramer is sort of the lead on the Genealogy Society. And Gene, if you're ready to go, I think this audience is ready to see the show.
Okay, so I'll try this again. Thank you very much for coming.
Okay.
It's my pleasure to start our program today with three ladies who wrote for the Algona newspapers through the years. First would be Evelyn Cady, and she is being portrayed by Jane Nettleton. The second is Esther Grace Pratt Sigsbee. She is being portrayed by Moni Westling. And Victoria Kessler is taking the role of Anne Stieberts Clark. And so I will ask those ladies to come forward.
Can you hear us? That's good enough, that's loud enough? Okay, good, because we do a lot with our hands, so if we're holding mics, that's not going to work very well. So, thank you for coming to tea today. It's so nice to have you here.
Tea? I don't drink tea.
Well, pardon me, I'll ask an aide from the home. Perhaps she can bring in some coffee.
Oh, never mind. I'm sure I've got a bag of instant tea in here somewhere. I know it's here somewhere. Oh, getting closer.
Dan, I know that you're prepared for any eventuality, and I do understand the notepad and the pin cushion, but a screwdriver?
Well, you never know when a shelf is going to collapse at Hansbrook Drug. And I don't want to waste any time getting things back in order. Oh, here it is, my package of instant coffee. Just pour me a half a cup. I like my coffee strong.
I am not surprised.
Evelyn, who are all these people? I didn't expect a crowd.
Now, Anne, these people have come to listen to voices from the past. And you have to admit, we certainly have all passed.
Yes, why don't we introduce ourselves? I'm Evelyn Cady, and for many years I wrote the Tidbits columns for the Algona newspapers.
And I am Esther Sigsbee. I wrote the Woman's World column in the Upper Des Moines using my middle name of Grace. I started writing in 1949 and continued for almost 19 years.
And I'm Ann Clark. I wrote the column entitled Around Algona. I wrote mostly about people and what they were doing around Algona.
Now, Evelyn, you and I were writing at about the same time, weren't we? What do you think made your column so unique?
I think people like the way that I wove Algona history into my columns. After all, I am the oldest of the three of us. I was born in 1892 in Algona, and I graduated from Algona High School in 1910. Over the years, I collected a lot of mementos, and those brought to mind stories from the past.
Well, I was so grateful to you for all of your help when I wrote the playlet for the Algona Centennial Pageant. Remember what fun that was? It was performed out at the fairgrounds in 1954. And it was just such a delightful time.
You know, people always said we should have written a book together. But then, Esther, you moved down to Sarasota, Florida in 1963, and then you died 4 years later.
Do you mind if I
Wait, just a minute. The Good Samaritan home does not allow smoking on the premises.
Oh, sorry. These are some pretty nice digs you got here, Evelyn. How is it that you got such a big room at a nursing home? And right out here in front, too.
Well, I pay for it. You may not know this, Anne, but this was once the home of Ambrose Call and his family. And this,
Really?
this room we're sitting in was the parlor.
Now, Anne, you might not know, but Evelyn has quite a life story. Would you like to tell us about your early dreams for yourself?
Yes, it certainly didn't involve writing for the Algona newspapers. When I was a young person, I dreamed of being a concert violinist, and I was often asked to perform at the Call Opera House. But then, my hands, and finally my whole body, became crippled with arthritis. By the time I was 22 years old, I was confined to a wheelchair. The only thing I had really left to me was my mind. I was really going into a depression, so my mother decided to have me work with relatives who worked at the Kossuth County Recorder's Office, the Frank Hendersons. And I also worked for the Deputy Recorder, O.J. Stevenson. You can imagine that I learned a lot about what was going on in Algona, working in that kind of a job. But then in 1940, I began to write columns for the newspaper.
And you were such a diligent news gatherer. Even when her body was racked with pain, she wrote some of the most wonderful stories. And they were not just the bare facts, they were human stories. I have really enjoyed the ones that you wrote about living here in Good Samaritan, and the ones about people who had overcome obstacles, such as polio.
Well, thank you. My hands often were so sore that I couldn't type, and holding a pen was very difficult, but I always made my deadlines.
And you have quite a story too, don't you? I know that pincushion has a part in it.
Well, yes, it does. My father, Frank, really loved steam engines, and he had a threshing ring around the Algona area. But Bianca, my mother, was quite a seamstress. I learned the skill just from watching her. But I was quite beside myself when she died. It was shortly after the birth of my little brother, Bill. Oh. And then to make matters worse, the church decided almost immediately that my father should marry this widower who had her own children, named Gertrude Coleman. I never did like her. But then I suppose she was okay, but she took the place of my mother.
That must have been terribly difficult for you, Anne.
It was, but I did finish high school in Algona High and graduated magna cum laude from Iowa Lakes Community College with an arts degree, an associate arts degree. And then the next year, in 1938, I met Homer, my husband. He was at a boarding house with my Aunt Lilith Foth. And it was a year later that we were married. It wasn't exactly a marriage made in heaven. I guess It might have had something to do with the fact that I was a little too opinionated. But he would take it as long as he could, and then he'd find a job out of town that made more money, and then he could get away from me for a while. But we always did love each other.
And you could sew beautifully.
Oh, yes, I could. That reminds me. My specialty was sewing wedding dresses. I'm working on one now, just part of it here. I'd make one a week. And then usually I was sewing for young girls who were in dance recitals making those costumes. And then a lot of times I'd make suits for our 3 sons. People always wondered how, when I smoked like a chimney, I could possibly turn out a beautiful wedding dress that fit perfectly, and yet not have a whiff of smoke on it. Well, I never smoked on the job.
Now we know the secret. Weren't you one of those people that met at Hansberg Drugs at the counter
Oh.
at 7:30 a.m. to talk over the day's events?
Yes, let's see, that was like the Algona's version of the round table at the Adirondack Hotel in New York City. There was Phil Diamond, Jack Clapsaddle, and Dutch, of course, and myself. I worked at Hansberg Drugs, so we'd meet early in the morning before we took off for our jobs. And we'd talk about the world events, local news in Algona. I suppose that's why the newspaper asked me to write an article. I knew everything that was happening in town.
Esther, didn't you win some award for your rights?
Yes, I did. I won the National Editors Association Award for one of my columns back in 1957.
Why don't you tell Ann how you got into the newspaper business?
Well, it was a fluke, really. I'd been a secretary at First Presbyterian Church for quite a while, and every now and then I would write a column for an area newspaper, but it certainly wasn't a full-time job by any means. And then one night, we were invited to dinner by some of our relatives, the Pratts. Well, I'll be honest with you, I think that was an excuse to show off their brand new television set. That was something, let me tell you. But after dinner, we had gathered in the kitchen just to chat over coffee and such, and the newspaper editor was also invited that evening. And our conversation got around to his business, and he commented that he would like to have more stories that would be of interest to women in the paper. And he was even entertaining the idea of having a female writer. Well, I immediately volunteered before I thought about it. And I realized that having 3 small children at home, I'd have to do all of my writing late at night after everyone else was sound asleep.
You know, Jack Shelley, the famous WHO radio storyteller, just loved women's world. And he often quoted it on his programs. I think his favorite column of all was 10 Commandments for Teachers.
Oh, I remember that one.
He always said, Grace, that you would have been one of the most famous women columnists in the United States if you hadn't put your husband Harlan and your 3 children first.
Well, it's a matter of priorities.
That's true. That is true. You know, before we end a segment of the program, there's one thing we want to ask you. In fact, there are a couple things. One, how many of you have ever had a garment made by Ann Clark? If you have, raise your hand. Okay, we've got at least one person.
This is part of it.
Jane, she sewed for many of us guys when you got a letter in a sport. You know, you bought your letter jacket, but then you had to get on the jacket, and Ann sewed all of those for a bunch of us.
Okay. Yes. And how many of you remember any of the rest of us? Either one of us? Oh, great. And we just want to say that, you know, there are many gifted women writers who have followed us. Dorothy Mucky, for many years, wrote wonderful columns, and she taught. She won many awards too, and she taught a lot of people how to write for a newspaper. And even today, Molly McDonald keeps us all laughing with her sly Irish wit. So we are very grateful for the women who still write stories telling about their lives and the things that they do in Algona today. Thank you.
Moment while we rearrange here. Okay, at the cemetery, we always.
No microphone.
Who's on it? There we go. All right. At the cemetery, we always have some guides who lead our groups around, and they have a little tidbit that they share about local history. This year, we decided to focus a little bit on the newspapers that had been in Algona. Upper Des Moines had just celebrated its 150th anniversary in December, so we thought it was a good time just to recognize them. So the first one we're going to talk about is The Bee. And the Monday Reading Club published the first edition of The Bee on December 27, 1857. It was read aloud by its editress, Harriet Taylor. The issues were all handwritten and is considered the first newspaper in the county. The first edition consisted of 7 pages of local stories and 1 page of news clippings from other magazines. The Bee contained community news such as marriages, deaths, and local events. It contained both prose and poetry and told of the hopes and disappointments of the citizens. The paper did not seem to have a regular publication schedule, and a new issue appeared as editors had time to produce it. Weather affected the production as well. The flooding of 1858 prevented new editions from March to November. No one knows how many issues of The Bee were actually published, but 23 survived. They were later bound into a book by Harvey Ingham, and the book was deposited at the State Historical Society of Iowa, where it is located to this day. And I'd like to introduce to you Ann Kohlhaus, who will be portraying Mary Emmeline Call, the eldest daughter of Asa and Sarah Call.
Good afternoon. I'm Mary Emmeline Call. I signed many of my paintings Mary M. Call. You may have heard that there was an art show exhibiting some of my paintings at the Algona Library. Well, I couldn't let that happen without me, and so I am buried in San Anselmo, California. I'm not here in Algona with my mother and father and many of my friends and relatives. I was born October 1864. I was the first of the Call daughters. My parents had 3 sons, and when I arrived, they were overjoyed to have a baby girl to spoil. And so My brothers had been born in a log cabin, and then I was born in a 2-story wooden house that was built in 1859. And I was not the only daughter for very long. Shortly after, my sisters, Sarah Stella, Nina Vista, and Zeta Cora followed me. We had all the love and the activities of a large family. My mother, Sarah Call, she had a very vivacious personality. She had that cheerful and hopeful temperament that made our house warm and welcoming. She loved to entertain, and she was really active in the community. She also, if someone was in need or if they had illness in their home, she would bring them food. I always admired my mother's courage in following my father into the wilderness to follow his dream of building a city. I'm also really proud of my father, who was one of the founders of Algona, Iowa. My father, Asa Call, he was tall and strong and well educated. He had a very quick mind, and he loved to read, especially the classics. And I can remember when we were small, we would just gather around his knees, and he would read to us from poets that were his favorite of the day. And he also was a very busy man, but he always made time for his family. He also really liked a good joke, and he had a large fund of humorous stories that he would tell as friends and acquaintances stopped by. I was only 12 years old when my mother passed. I could see how losing a loving companion affected my father. I tried to do my part, but without her kind and gentle spirit, our house, it just felt cold and empty. At that time, our aunts, Nancy Henderson Call and Mary Call Blackford, they were like angels to us, and I'll never forget their kindness. By the time my father built his last home, that was called the Call Mansion, in 1884, I had lived away from home for quite some time. First, I went to Notre Dame, and then I decided to study art because painting was my passion. And I was so lucky because my father supported me in going into the arts. And so first I studied in Chicago, and then I went to Boston, and it was at Boston that I met John J. Innerking. He was the most eminent landscape painter in the Boston area. And he said, it's not just natural talent, that artists have to train in every aspect of their interest. And you know, that was very, very good advice. He painted scenes of French countrysides and Boston landscapes, and the use of color in the background. His use of color was extraordinary. And I do feel that Professor Innerking was the biggest influence in my career. Now, I had a lot of other wonderful teachers, and I was so fortunate as to belong to the New York Art League. And there I met Frank Dumont, Louis Muir, and William Merritt Chase. And it was with William Chase that I spent a summer studying, and we traveled to Europe. And that was just unforgettable. I received the sad news of my father's death in January of 1888. He had been a victim of some paralytic strokes for the last 4 years, and he had even traveled out to San Francisco, California, in hopes of regaining his health. But he died there at the age of 63. And so I returned to Algona to help my brother George make funeral arrangements. It was a cold and blustery afternoon, the day of the funeral, but we still had a large crowd. My father's body was laid in repose at the Thornton House. And then his coffin, he was buried at Riverview Cemetery. It wasn't until 1891 that my brother George decided to build the mausoleum out at the cemetery, and then the bodies of my parents were moved to that site where they reside today. In fact, my brother George, he became like the head of the family. My oldest brother, Asa Frank, he lived over in Sioux City, and Joe Henry, he had moved clear to California. And my two younger sisters had not reached the age of majority. And so George postponed marriage until all his sisters were married. And a matter of fact, I was wed at George's house here in Albona. I married Dr. Frederick Perkins of Minneapolis. And we were surrounded by friends and family that afternoon. We made our new home in Manchester, New Hampshire, where Fred practiced medicine, and I soon joined some art circles. Then my sister, Stella Spencer, she died suddenly in 1896, leaving behind a 4-year-old son, William Call Spencer, who I fondly nicknamed Call. Her husband felt that he just could not raise his child by himself, and so I quickly took on the responsibility of raising Call. We would take trips, and quite often we'd go up to Dubuque, Minnesota to visit his father, because I thought that was right. But even when his father remarried, Call remained with me. And I truly feel that Call was my son. After my father's death, my father had set up a trust fund for all of his children. And we had Call receive Stella's share. This trust gave us a comfortable living to live with. But my husband, he would keep telling me that I should ask for a larger share every month, or that I should just claim my full inheritance. And this caused a lot of stress in our marriage. And so in April of 1910, my husband and I divorced after 21 years. He married 6 days later. I took my maiden name back. So following my divorce, I traveled to Europe, and then I settled in France. And oh, how I did love it there. And the French countryside became the subject of my paintings. And I so enjoyed it. And I was just starting to get international acclaim. And then just 4 short years later, in 1914, World War I broke out. And my comfortable and content life in France was to an end. George sent me a letter and money for passage back. He was afraid that I was in danger in France. And so I traveled back here. I was in this area for a while, and my brother Henry had been encouraging me to move to California. And I have to say that the climate in California was pretty attractive to me. And so after a little while, I did move, and I bought a small house in San Anselmo, and I joined a small art group of 5 artists, and we'd get together and we'd sketch, and we'd share our skills. And around 1927, we did an art show, and the audience was so enthusiastic that we formed the Marin Art Association. And in 1930, I was the president of that association, and we built new offices and started offering art classes. but then the Depression took its toll and we lost funding and we almost totally disbanded. But then slowly we started offering lectures and crafts and children's art classes and adults, and we changed the name to Marion Society of Artists, and that association is still in existence today. I had many art shows over the years. My very last large show was in 1951 at Larkspur, California. My work was known internationally by that time, and I had been, was on the list for many years of a who's who of art. I was a member of many art-related organizations, including the Women Painters of France. And in my late 80s, the scourge of my family, a stroke, struck me down. I was bedridden for 5 years, and I died at the age of 93. Although I am gone, my paintings live on, and they show the world of beauty that was around me. I am once again delighted to have my artwork on display, and I'm especially delighted to be back in my hometown of Algona that I love.
First known as the Pioneer Press and published by Ambrose Call, the Algona Upper Des Moines was purchased in 1865 by Lizzie Reed and her husband, Dr. S.G.A. Reed, who changed the name to the Upper Des Moines. They moved the printing press to their home where the newspaper was produced. A series of challenges, including an unreliable press, caused many delays, and so the Upper Des Moines was never published on a regular schedule. In the summer of 1866, J.H. Warren and Sons came to town and took over the newspaper. From that point forward, it has been published weekly. At that time, newspapers often had a definite political slant. When the newspaper merged with the Algona Republican, it became known for a number of years as the Upper Des Moines Republican. In 2016, the newspaper celebrated its 150th year of continual weekly publication. This past March, it was renamed the Kasuth County Advance. And now I'd like to introduce J.F. Overmeyer, who is being portrayed by Blair Redinius, his wife, Edith Overmeyer, who is portrayed by Julie Buchanan, a fellow teacher and principal, Minnie Coate, and Courtney Westling will be portraying Minnie, and finally Caleb Holmes will represent a farm wife just north of Algona.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am J.F. Overmeyer. Many of you know that name because of a street in the south end of town. My wife, Edith, and I now reside at the Riverview Cemetery. Algona's been good to us, and we are pleased that you came to listen to our story. I was born on a farm home in northwest Ohio, near the town of Lindsay, in the month of February, a year after the Civil War ended. I did love the rural life, although, like many, I knew that the future was in the West. I was a thinker, a planner, and a man of letters. So I headed to Drake University in Des Moines and studied there. I followed that up by going to the State University of Iowa in Iowa City. And in 1896, I received my master's degree. My first job after that master's was being superintendent of the Lennox schools in South Dakota. Then I went to Danbury, Iowa, and then to Parkersburg, Iowa, also as superintendent.
Parkersburg was where we met. I was 10 years younger than Fred, as most people called him. We were married on my birthday, Christmas Day, 1903, at the home of my parents in Trail. Neither of us was a spring chicken. Why, I was 27 years old. But we were happy that we waited to find each other.
Shortly after our wedding, I was offered the position of city superintendent of the Algona schools, along with teaching mathematics and political science. I was excited at the prospect of being part of a school system where education was, and still is, highly prized. The Algona system had 3 brick buildings. The first of the brick buildings, built in 1896, was Central School on Harlan Street. The second one was the 3rd Ward over on Elm Street, built in 1896. And then the prize of all was Bryant School, built in 1899.
We moved to Algona in 1904 because the Algona schools needed a superintendent right away. Quickly we knew that we had found a home for the rest of our lives here in Algona.
For the next 30 years, I devoted my time and energy to the development of students and of teachers. In the students, I worked to develop their confidence, of course, build a firm foundation of knowledge and intelligence, but I wanted them to be prepared to be leaders in their community.
Superintendent Overmeyer must have had a special place in his heart for people like me. Until I came to Algona High School, I had attended a country school north of town. That was familiar territory for me. The school was close to our farm, and sometimes the teacher stayed at our house. Several of my brothers and sisters, and even some of my cousins, were my classmates. We defended each other when some of the bigger and older boys tried to get rough with us. And we helped out the little kids learn their lessons and had fun playing baseball outside at recess, from the youngest ones on up. My teachers all seemed to think that I was a good student, and they encouraged my parents to send me to Algona to high school. That was a big step for all of us. Algona was still way too far away for me to live at home, so my parents arranged for a couple for me to stay with in town during the week. In exchange for my room and board, I did chores inside their house and around the yard, and I worked at their downtown store after school. My first day at Bryant High School was pure agony. I didn't know a soul, and the town kids always seemed to have their pals. My mom had cut my hair as long as I could remember, and a lot of kids snickered about my bowl cut and my farmer clothes. I was already homesick, and this was like the last straw. Then I happened to pass Superintendent Overmeyer's office, and he was standing outside the door and asked how my day was going, and called me by my name. And my parents had met him during the summer when I had enrolled, and I never dreamed that he would remember my name. And he had a twinkle in his eye and said that I would see him in mathematics later that day. As the year went by, he was always available for questions after class, and encouraged me to try some of the extracurricular activities, like declamation. And that is where he taught me how to organize a speech and present it in a persuasive way. He knew just how to suggest an idea so that it sounded like a good one. He also talked me into throwing shot and discus, because he knew that I lifted lots of bales of hay and straw on the farm. After a while, I began to actually make friends at Algona and feel at home at the high school. But I don't think that I would have made it past the first day if it hadn't been for Superintendent Overmeyer. He was a really true friend.
Fred did have a soft spot for country students. He always said that he knew how overwhelmed he had felt when he started high school in Ohio. And he wanted to help the ones who seemed to lack confidence when they came to his school. Meanwhile, at home, I gave birth to June Adele, our only child. She was our joy, and the faculty members and students who visited our home loved playing with her.
Cultivating a gifted and responsible faculty was also a goal of mine. I was fortunate to have a colleague in Miss Minnie Cope to help me in this venture. Miss Cope was already the first woman principal in Algona when I came in 1904. She was a strict disciplinarian, both on students and the faculty. On the other hand, she was a kind soul. And after my time, I believe for many years, a scholarship was given in her name to the student with the highest academic ability.
Thank you, Superintendent. When you came in the middle of a school year at a very trying time, we soon recognized that you were a practical person who met emergencies calmly and disliked any sort of posturing. You gave us sound advice, both on school as well as personal matters. Before long, you were recognized as one of the outstanding superintendents in Iowa, and your judgment was widely sought in educational circles. You were honored many times by the State Teachers Association, and at one time served as its president. The faculty of the Algona School saw you as a friend as well as leader. You were an example to us in Christian service too. You seemed happiest in your church work, first as steward of the Methodist Church, then as president of the Board of Trustees. I think you also taught the Home Builder Sunday School class, correct?
How true, Minnie. Fred and I both enjoyed our Methodist church. He had many duties, and I also served several times as the president of the Methodist Ladies' Aid. Our interests also extended to civic organizations. Fred was a member of the local Masonic Lodge, and I was a member of Eastern Star. Fred was a Rotarian for over 20 years, and I was a member of the Home Economics Club and the Ladies and the Library Aid. Fred was also a director of the Hoverton Elevator Company and the Iowa State Bank.
In all of his involvement, Superintendent Overmeyer always kept the welfare in mind, community in mind, and put his family and schools first.
I did become involved in many community projects, but I would say my biggest project was the building of the new high school, named after the person that took my job, O.B. Lang. Central School was already showing its age. Bryant School was needing more space and new facilities. So in the late 1920s, the school board and community members agreed that the best plan would be to tear down Central School and build a new high school in that same spot. Then the stock market crashed in 1929. It was a frightening time for all of us, but we had to move forward. We'd already started the demolition of Central School. That school, however, gave us all hope. Everyone was excited to the new auditorium, the new gymnasium, and additional vocational classes. Seeing that school rising up from the rubble gave all of us hope during those desperate days of the 1930s. We then had our last graduating class at Bryant in 1931, and in the fall of 1931, students began going to the new school on Harlan Street. I spent the rest of the months getting things in order, making sure that everything was on schedule, the budget under control, and for the next couple of years I decided it was time that I needed to retire and even play a little more golf. And in 1934, that's what I did.
That was when we realized how much we all depended on Superintendent Overmeyer.
Fred did not get much of a rest because he was elected to the city council that very year. He served continuously from that time on. When Mayor C.F. Speck died on March 1st, 1942, Fred was elected mayor of Algona. His term was short due to his sudden death on June 11, 1942. We, his family, and many friends were all devastated at his passing. The funeral was a huge one, with hundreds of friends and former students in attendance. And he proved to be one of the finest teachers, men, and citizens of our community. We thank you so much for coming to hear his story just one more time.
The last newspaper that we're going to talk about was the Cassuth County Advance. Starting out as the Algona Advance, it was first published in August of 1901. Financially backed by George C. Call, Benjamin Reed was its first managing editor. Ben Reed had a law license, but had always loved writing, in which he later demonstrated by writing the 2-volume History of Cassuth County. The paper was sold to W.C. Duell in 1908. He changed the name to the Cassuth County Advance. In 1942, he partnered with his son Duane, who went on to own the newspaper following his father's death. Both of the Duells were named Master Editors by the Iowa Press Association, the profession's highest award. The Advance was published on a weekly basis until 1970, when it merged with the Algona Upper Des Moines. And our last presentation of the day is going to be Miss Lucia Wallace, and she's portrayed by Susan Legore.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Lucia Wallace, a longtime teacher in the Algona Community School District. And yes, there was a person before there was a school. I was honored at the end of my long career to have an elementary school here in town named after me. But let's start at the beginning. I was born just 2 years after the end of the Civil War on a farm near Algona. My parents were John and Nancy Reed Wallace. We had a full house with 6 girls and 1 boy. My father was a veteran of the war, having served in Company A of the 1st Wisconsin Cavalry. I was educated locally and was a member of the 2nd graduating class of Algona High School in 1885. I was able to go on to college, but although I attended colleges at both the University of Minnesota and Columbia University, I never actually received a college degree. However, that did not prevent me from becoming a teacher. I began teaching in 1890 in Bancroft, and after several years there, I transferred to a school in Parker, South Dakota. But I came back to Algona in 1907 and began teaching at Bryant School, where I continued to teach various primary grades until my retirement 32 years later. At the time of my return to Algona, I found a room at the home of Bert Palmer's, where I stayed for some years. But eventually, I purchased a stucco house right on the edge of the Bryant property, which made it very convenient for me. I loved to entertain and welcome friends, so my home was always buzzing with activity. As one of the founders of the Candlelight Bridge Club, I often hosted the meetings at my house, serving dinner to the members. Sometimes, however, the club members would start with dinner at one of the local restaurants, such as the Algona Hotel, and then we would retire to one of our homes for a very lively game of bridge. I was also involved in PEO, Bel Canto, and the Congregational Church. I always tried to be an enthusiastic supporter of organizations that I belonged to. I clearly remember the Women's Library Aid Society's large white elephant sale in November of 1922, which was followed by a dinner and program. As part of the performance, I was cajoled into singing several vocal selections along with Dr. Rist. Although my days were filled with classroom activities, I still loved spending time with young people outside of school hours. They seemed to enjoy my company too, often inviting me to their non-school functions. In the summer of 1920, I was a guest at several different camps, one for the Almu Campfire Girls and one for the Iwaloga Campfire Girls. Years later, those same girls, now grown women, stayed in touch with me and would often visit at my home. In fact, I was still in contact with many of my students long after my retirement. have to tell you that I loved to travel. In 1912, I took a boat trip down the Mississippi River. I started at St. Paul, went on to St. Louis, and ended up at New Orleans. From there, I traveled to Bay Minette, Alabama to visit my parents. When I retired in May of 1932, I rented out my home for a year to E.C. and Frances McMahon, who were newlyweds at the time. I spent that entire year traveling. It was glorious. I enjoyed my newfound freedom so much. First, I went to visit a sister of mine who was living in Wisconsin, and then I traveled to Florida to spend the winter with another one of my sisters. En route, I took in the Chicago World's Fair, which I found to be so interesting and educational. Upon my return, I was asked to speak at many local fraternal organizations, telling of all my travels. During the Second World War, I found new purpose as the county chairman of the Committee of School Stamp and Bond Sales, sometimes known as the Schools at War program. Our committee worked with the local schools to raise funds to purchase stamps and bonds to support the war effort. This united two of my loves, raising funds for a good cause and allowing me to interact with students once again. After many years, I sold my beloved house to the Algona Community School District so that the Bryant property could be enlarged. The school district allowed me to continue living in my house rent-free until my death. The greatest accolade I received during my lifetime, though, was the naming of a school building in my honor. Built at a cost of $266,300, it was the first public elementary building to be constructed in Algona since 1898. Classes began there in September of 1952, but the formal dedication did not occur until December 9th of that year. As the honored guest, I spoke briefly of my teaching career and how privileged I was to receive this special tribute. I felt so humbled by all the kind words spoken on my behalf and the large crowd that included many of my former students and fellow teachers. I must admit, though, that I felt very tired as I left for home that evening. And just a few days later, right before Christmas, I suffered a stroke which took my life on January 8th, 1953, at the age of 85. I would like to share with you a tribute that was written upon my death by T.H. Chryscilis and appeared in the Algona newspaper. These are his words. Lucia Wallace possessed to a remarkable degree a quality which, for lack of a better phrase, we may call the zest for living. Her interests, up until almost the very hour she passed away, were as varied as to include membership in Bel Canto, League of Women Voters, and interests in everything musical and cultural in the community. Hers was a lively, stimulating world, and no subject, whether it was political, religious, civic, or cultural, escaped her attention. When her eyes failed, she maintained her mental sprightliness by listening to worthwhile programs on the radio and by constant communication with neighbors and friends. Her home was a convenient meeting place for friends whose views and opinions kept her constantly in touch with affairs local, national, and international. She was spoken of most often by those close to her as Auntie Lou, and she had that faculty of drawing to her fireside friends of various views, opinions, creeds, thus continually broadening her outlook on life and maintaining fresh and stimulating impressions. Her long and devoted service in the Algona Public School is a debt this community can never repay. nor can her contribution to the cultural growth of Algona be estimated. She taxed mental and physical powers to the utmost, especially during the last year. But her zest for living never lagged, and her continued attendance at school functions, be they concerts or class plays or even a hot lunch, was astounding considering the endurance handicaps they involved. One of her last public appearances was on the occasion of a garage opening, which she insisted on attending despite the fact that it taxed her frail strength. It almost seems, as we look back, that she lived this past year by some superhuman effort in order to participate personally in her greatest triumph, the opening of Algona's newest and most beautiful grade school named in her honor, the Lucia Wallace School. But hers was a world of the spirit and the mind much more than the material. Kind and sympathetic, cheerful, always optimistic, stimulating and refreshing to visit with, a gracious hostess, a loyal friend, and a truly remarkable woman. Lucia Wallace left her imprint on this community, which even the passing of the years will fail to obliterate. She is truly an immortal. Well, Mr. Chryscilis's words almost make me cry. I did have a wonderful life being a part of the lives of so many of Algona's children, and I am honored that my legacy lives on through the school that still bears my name. Thank you for coming to reminisce with me this afternoon. I would just like to ask if there are any, first of all, I ask if there are any teachers that taught at Lucia Wallace School. Raise your hand. Keith, anybody else teach at Lucia Wallace? Okay. All right, well then maybe there will be more hands go up if I see how many of you attended Lucia Wallace School. Ah, you more, good, good, all right. And maybe even more so if I say how many of you have children that attended Lucia Wallace School. Oh, definitely. Well, good. I hope you enjoyed the story of Lucia Wallace.
And that almost concludes our program, but we've had a tradition that Fritz Nielsen sings the Algona song for us, so he'll close our program.
Well, I want to take you back to 1926. That's the year I was born. Maybe you math students can figure that out. 1926, I was born. I was born here in Algona. Born and raised in Algona. That's why I'm so proud of Algona. I taught here for 40 years. Taught in several other schools. They named a little kid's wrestling tournament after me, so that's part of my history. My dad was a painter, so that made painting out here a lot easier for me because I knew how to do it. My crew and I painted this whole building, inside and outside, twice already. And I was in charge of that. I had they have what they call a board of 6 people, 3 from the Star and 3 from the Masons, that kind of take care of this building. We came into this building in 1972, and at that time we rejuvenated the paint job, and I had some good workers that helped me, and I'm still on that committee. I don't know why, but maybe it's because I like to paint stuff. Okay, now, I want to tell you about this song I'm going to sing. Maybe some of you have heard it before, some of you have not maybe, but Algona had a young man by the name of Bob DeBar that was running for state president of the Iowa Jaycees. And he wanted some help. He wanted some publicity about it. So he got a hold of a guy by the name of Dick Post and Dr. Shirk, who lived here in Algona, and they decided to write a song because when people come up and say, "Where are you from?" "Well, I'm from Algona, that great big busy town, right in the middle of the USA, between the New York Harbor and the San Francisco Bay, where the wonderful East meets the beautiful West, for it's the only town I know. I'm shouting so loud of it because I'm so proud of it. Algona, my hometown." Not only was born in Algona, but I taught school here for 40 years in Algona. I graduated from Algona High School. I had 4 children, and they were all here for Memorial Day. We had a garage sale. That's the way to get rid of things. But I still live here in Algona. I lost my wife about a year and a half ago, and I'm in need of some help. I have lots of help, and my daughter was here today, fixed a meal for me and everything. So that's what children are for. So have lots of children, and they'll take care of you. Okay, thank you for letting me have a little time. And like I say, I'm in charge of this building. I have been in charge of it since 1972. And anybody that wants to use it can call me and make a reservation. And I'll tell you the price later on. All right, thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.
I just didn't want you to have to be looking into the sun, enjoying the shade a little bit. So. Ready? Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Oh, thank you. I am Lucia Wallace, a longtime teacher in the Algona Community School District. Yes, there was a person before there was a school building. I was honored at the end of my long career to have an elementary school here in town named after me. But perhaps we should start at the beginning. I was born just 2 years after the Civil War on a farm near Algona. My parents were John and Nancy Reed Wallace. We had a full house with 6 girls and 1 boy. My father was a veteran of the war, having served in Company A of the 1st Wisconsin Cavalry.
Until I came to Algona High School, I had attended a country school north of town. That was familiar territory for me. The school was close to our farm, and sometimes the teachers stayed at our house. Several of my brothers and sisters, and even some of my cousins, were my classmates. And we defended each other when some of the bigger and older boys tried to get rough with us. We helped the little kids learn their lessons, and we had fun playing baseball outside of recess, from the youngest ones on up. My teachers all seemed to think that I was a good student. They all encouraged my parents to send me to Algona High School. That was a big step for all of us. Algona was way too far away for me to live at home, though. So my parents arranged for me to stay with a couple in town during the week. In exchange for my room and board, I did chores around the yard and helped out at their store downtown after school. My first day at Bryant High School was pure agony. I didn't know a soul, and the kids always seemed to have their pals. My mom had cut my hair as long as I could remember, and it was a bowl cut, and they made fun of that and my clothes. And I was already homesick, and this was like the last straw. Then I happened to pass Superintendent Obermeyer's office, and he was standing outside the door. He walked over to me and called me by my name, and he asked how things were going. My parents had had him meet me in the summer when I enrolled at the high school, but I had never dreamed he would recall me by my name. He had a twinkle in his eye, and he said that I would see him in mathematics class that day. As the year went by, He was always available for questions after class and encouraged me to try.
But my contentment was not to last. Just 4 short years later, in 1914, World War I broke out, and George sent passage because he feared that I was in danger. And so I traveled back and left my idyllic life in France. My brother, Henry, so I stayed here in the area for a short time, and then my brother, Harry, encouraged me to move to California. And I have to admit that the climate there did hold an attraction. And so after a short while, I bought a home in Soma, California. And there I joined a small group of artists. There were 5 of us. And we would sketch and share skills with each other. And in 1927, we put together, it's called the Marin Art Association. And we had a large art show, and the crowd was so enthusiastic about it. So in 1930, I became the president. And then we started offering art classes, and the association kept growing. And then the Depression took its toll. And because of lack of funding, we almost folded.
Weren't you one of those people that met at 7:30 a.m. at Hans Brook's Drug at the counter to talk about all the day's events?
Yes, I was. Let's see, there was Phil and
Bill Diamond?
Bill Diamond, that's right. And then some attorneys, like Jack Clapsaddle, and then Dutch, of course, and myself. We'd usually meet in the morning, and I actually worked at Hans Brook Drug. And then we'd have a nice chat about the world events and what was happening in Algona. And then we'd take off for our jobs. I suppose that's why the newspaper asked me to write a column. I knew everything that was happening in town.
So many people don't like it.
Well,
Our daughter-in-law, her mother was in